Okay, everyone. So for the next session, we're very lucky to have Dongwoo Kim. He's an assistant professor in philosophy and digital humanities at Korea Advanced Institute. And he's known for contributing to Truthmaker Semantics, in particular on modal logic, with a very nice paper that came last year, I think. And so today he's talking about an exact semantics for counterfactual. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Mark, for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks, Lucas, for organizing this wonderful event and for having me. And it's a great honor to present my work to the distinguished philosophers and linguists and logicians. Right. So I'm going to talk about. I should really have changed the title. It's towards an exact truthmaker semantics for counterfactuals. Let me give you a bit of background to this presentation. So I had all my formal results ready. What I had trouble with was rather to motivate my approach philosophically. Okay. And Mark told us about his panicky moment in shower, right? And I had that panicky moment the day before I get on the plane to Munich. So I worked on most of these slides in my flight to Munich, and after I arrived to Munich, at Munich. So these are very fresh ideas, philosophical motivations behind my formal results. So let me get started. All right, so maybe this one is not working, but that's fine. This should be fine. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I would like to offer a bilateralist exact truthmaker semantics for counterfactual conditionals or URIF conditional of this form. Okay. So A is antecedent, C is the consequent. Okay. If A were the case, then it would be the case that C. Okay. And my main proposal will be these two. An exact verifier for this counterfactual conditional is an exact preclusion on the outcomes of making A true that fails to make C true. Okay. And an exact falsifier for this counterfactual exactly countenances as possible some outcome of making A exactly true that makes C false. So in my earlier paper on modal logic, I introduced this allowing relation and banning relation. I just changed the term, preclusion, think impossible, right? So it's impossible for the outcomes of A to make C false, right? Or not true. That's the idea. And this is the, so exact falsifier should think it's possible, right? To make A true while C false. So that's the intuitive idea. And my plan for this talk is as follows. I want the philosophical motivations behind my semantics to be general enough, that meaning it goes beyond just the truthmaker semantical approach. So it comes out of very general consideration. I'm not going to assume anything about truthmaker semantics at the beginning. I'm just going to introduce two notions of indeterminacy and argue that they create a problem, a general problem, but this is I think it's of constructive significance to any attempt at providing bilateralist truthmaker semantics for counterfactuals. And then I'll examine fine semantics in his pioneering paper illustrating how this problem arises within within the context of his theory. And then I'll offer my solution to the problem and motivate my own analysis. Okay. All right. So as I said, my talk will be mainly philosophical, focusing on philosophical considerations to motivate my own analysis. I shall omit most of the formal details, and I shall only report some technical results towards the end of the talk. And what's the upshot? The upshot is that's how I started working on this. I was interested in providing an exactification of fine semantics. In that paper, Fine just offers truth conditions for a counterfactual. I wanted to find out an exact truthmaker semantics. Identify exact truthmaker for counterfactuals, and then show that this new semantics or exactification of fine semantics gives us exact same logic as his. And surprisingly, the semantics if you develop a truthmaker semantic analysis of counterfactuals on the basis of these two, then you can have exact same logic. Interestingly, under precisely the same constraints on the outcome relation that Fine puts on his outcome relation in the paper. So in this regard, my proposal can be considered an exactification of fine semantics. All right. So here's the outline. I just did the introduction. So I'm going to introduce a problem of indeterminacy, and then I'll illustrate the problem, how that problem arises within truthmaker semantics context by examining Fine's analysis, and then I'll motivate my own exact semantics, and then I'll give you the conclusion, which is a brief summary. Okay, so let me discuss the problem of indeterminacy. All right, so I think this was an intuitive idea actually from Fine's semantics, but I think it's anyway intuitive, right? So there is an intuitive idea of an action having a consequence or a change resulting in an outcome. So this is an intuitive idea. And this idea seems to relate closely to counterfactuals because when you evaluate whether this counterfactual is true, right, you want to consider various ways of making A true and assess whether C would be true under those resulting circumstances, right? I think this is an underlying idea behind interventionist semantics as well. But I would like to suggest that a problem arises when we think about counterfactuals, not in terms of possible worlds, but in terms of these specific changes and resulting outcomes. What's the problem? So suppose we want to evaluate whether this counterfactual is true. Okay, so that's the situation. I would like to call an A outcome, just any outcome of making A true. So you make some changes so as to make A true. Then, there will be outcome. Okay. And A outcome is said to be C verifying when it's the circumstance in which C is true. Okay. So an A outcome that is C verifying is a circumstance in which C is true. We can also say an A outcome is C falsifying when it's a circumstance in which C is false. All right. Then one might naturally think that this counterfactual is true just in case all possible A outcomes are C verifying. That's very straightforward analysis. All right. But I would like to suggest that when we think of counterfactuals in terms of specific changes in outcomes, we can make intuitive sense of the notion of an indeterminate outcome. What do I mean by that? There might be an A outcome that is neither C verifying nor C falsifying. So it doesn't decide C in any way. Okay. So it's all right. So call such an A outcome C indeterminate. Okay. It's not that you have two outcomes, right? One in which C is true and the other in which C is false. Rather, you have an outcome in which C is just undecided. So that's a C indeterminate outcome. Okay. And I think if you like to think of, if you're already in the Truthmaker Semantics, right, this should make sense. But, regardless, I think if you think about like small parts of the world, then, it doesn't have to, we don't have to assume that everything will be decided in one way or another in those small circumstances, right? All right. So I would like to draw a distinction here in terms of, in light of the notion of consequent indeterminacy, where C is indeterminate, right? One is strong counter outcome to the counterfactual of interest. A outcome that is C falsifying. And there is a weak counter outcome, an A outcome that doesn't verify C. It fails to verify C. So if you think about it, it's obvious that C indeterminate outcomes constitute only weak counter outcome. And if you restrict yourself to consistent, right, states or circumstances, strong counter outcomes, right, they are C falsifying. So given consistency, they will not false verify, right? So strong counter outcomes will be weak counter outcomes. Okay. All right. So that's the notion of consequent indeterminacy, and two distinctions are related to the notion of consequent indeterminacy. Okay. Now, I would like to introduce another notion of indeterminacy. I think it relates to what Lucas has suggested today. I would like to call an A outcome modally indeterminate when it's neither possible nor impossible. So it's just indeterminate in its modal status, right? We do not, well, I don't want to give it an epistemic flavor, but we just don't know, right? Whether it's possible or not, or possible or impossible, right? So here's an example. Let T be a particular table made from a certain piece of wood. All right. The famous, right, the table case. So assume that building T with a different piece of wood, so results in having T, right, the very table, while leaving W untouched. Right. So that outcome relation should be intuitive. But assume further that it's just indeterminate whether building T with a different piece of wood is possible. There's just no fact of the matter. If you want to put it metaphysically, right, about whether this is possible or impossible, or if you like to think of it epistemically, you just don't know. Okay. Right. Then it seems reasonable to think that it's also indeterminate whether it's possible to have T with W intact. Right. So if you, so what I wanted to say is that modal indeterminacy might channel, right, from a change to its outcome. So as long as you think there is a modally indeterminate state, right, that's neither possible nor impossible, then, it's their outcomes, right, might also be modally indeterminate. Right? So unless you're a determinist, in a very strong sense, nothing's never, right, in the mode, right, then I think this notion should make some sense. All right. So now I'd like to examine the simple analysis with these two notions of indeterminacy. And I'd like to discuss what problem they create. All right. So let's take each direction in turn. Let me first take the necessary sufficient condition. Right? Oh, sorry. Necessary condition, right? Only if direction. So suppose you have two possible outcomes of making A true. U1, C verifying. U2, C indeterminate. Then there is a possible outcome that is not C verifying. So the right-hand side condition, necessary condition, should fail. Therefore, the counterfactual should not be true. Okay. However, it's unreasonable. It's not unreasonable to assume that. So U2 is only a weak counter outcome, right? And it's not unreasonable to assume that weak counter outcome, they are not by themselves sufficient to refute counterfactuals as false or falsify counterfactuals. Okay. In other words, counterfactual is false just in case there is a strong, right, possible counter outcome. And if you think that, then the counterfactual should be neither true nor false, and that contradicts the principle of bivalence. Okay, so that's one issue. Let me consider the other direction. All possible A outcomes are C verifying, so that's sufficient condition direction. And here I would like to consider a situation where there are three A outcomes. I mean, U1 is not really necessary, but okay. Anyways, so U1 is possible and C verifying. And U2 is modally indeterminate, so it's not possible, and C falsifying. And U3 is modally indeterminate, so it's not possible, and C indeterminate. Then, since U1 is the only possible A outcome, the left-hand side condition, and it's C verifying, so the left-hand side condition holds. So this counterfactual should be true. However, it's not unreasonable to think that in this case, there are some, dangling counter outcomes, so to speak, right? U2 and U3, there are outcomes, right, of making A true, but they're modally indeterminate. And there are more, right, of such modally indeterminate outcomes. In such a case, why should we say that this is true? Okay. If you think that, then you might have this idea. The counterfactual is true just in case all counter outcomes are impossible. So that's a stricter condition for the truth of counterfactual. So if you think this, right, then U2 and U3 are counter outcomes and they are not excluded. They're not impossible. They're modally indeterminate. Right? So this condition fails. So counterfactual should not be true, contradicting the simple analysis. Okay. So that's a problem. All right. So what I want to suggest is that simple analysis is not. This is not what I want to say, right? A simple analysis is not untenable. Is untenable. That's not what I want to say. Okay. It's just that I want to see just the considerations so far show just that the simple analysis may conflict with some other assumptions, right? About those indeterminate cases, right? So if we assume the principle of bivalence, the simple analysis is just a conjunction of these two. But it's not entirely clear in the case of the first one, how modally indeterminate counter outcomes should be, why they should be irrelevant to the truth of the counterfactual, and why weak counterexample should be sufficient to refute counterfactual as false. So these are questions, right? And depending on your answers, they may conflict with the simple analysis, right? And that gives you a problem. So you have to make up your mind, so to speak, as to what you want to do with this indeterminate cases. There might be modal indeterminate, they might be consequent indeterminate. All right. And I would like to suggest that these two questions are of constructive significance to us, right? Who are working in Truthmaker Semantics. Why? Well, I take the core idea behind Truthmaker Semantics, the exact version, is that every true statement is made true by something, and that something must be entirely relevant, right, to the truth of the statement, and that we call an exact verifier or truth maker. And one of its central tasks, given this idea, is what Fine called exactification. So you have truth conditions for some statements of interest, and you want to identify their exact truth makers, right there. And then you want to give an account of their truth conditions in terms of their truth makers, right? So if that's what you want to do, right, and right, if you think that the truth condition of counterfactual is given along these lines, right, then you might think this condition, this analysis is natural. An exact truth maker for the counterfactual is whatever ensures of each and every, twice, apologies, each and every possible A outcome that is C verified. I think at one point, Professor Fine called it enabler, something like that. But you know, if you think we might have modal indeterminacy, then we're compelled to ask whether it should also be required that an exact truth maker should exclude weak counter outcomes as well. Okay. So that's the question that naturally arises when you try to exactify the simple analysis. And similarly, if you have the simple analysis in mind and trying to exactify it, then the natural suggestion would be this: an exact falsity maker or falsifier for that statement is whatever ensures the possibility of an A outcome failing to verify C, right? The possibility of weak counter outcome. But as noted before, an A outcome that failed to verify C need not falsify C. It might just be C indeterminate, so may not constitute a strong counter outcome. But perhaps shouldn't we require that an exact falsifier for a counterfactual guarantee the possibility of a strong counter outcome? So if you think about like consequent indeterminacy, this question I think naturally arises, and you have to make a theoretical decision, right, in trying to provide an exact semantics for counterfactuals. Okay. So let me give you the plan again in light of this discussion. So I'll discuss fine semantics for counterfactual and argue that the questions that I just raised arise within his theory as well. And so building on that analysis of fine semantics, I would like to offer my own analysis. And I'm just repeating. And the idea is this: an exact verifier should preclude as impossible every counter outcome, weak or strong, doesn't matter. So any A outcome that doesn't verify C should be excluded. So it's a stronger restrictor right, condition for the truth. An exact falsifier should think possible that there is a strong counter outcome. So this is also stricter condition. We don't allow a weak counter outcome to refute counterfactual. Okay. And if time permits, I shall examine the logic of counterfactuals under these analysis. All right, so let me now turn to Fine's analysis of counterfactual conditionals. All right, so the following two principles form the basis of Fine's analysis. These two, universal realizability of the antecedent and the universal verifiability of the consequent. So you have to consider every way in which A might be true, and consequent must be true in every outcome. So this. And this is not said explicit, but I think the idea is to take these two conditions together as jointly providing a sufficient condition for the truth of counterfactual. So the proposal is this. I mean, it's still informal, but you get the idea. Counterfactual is true just in case every possible outcome of A contains C state, meaning a state that verifies C. And as you can already see, this looks like the simple analysis, right, that I discussed earlier. And so you may anticipate that a similar problems might arise for semantics as well. And what I like to do is just to, show you what the problem, how they really arise, right? Okay, so to do so, let me give a bit of formalization. So modalized state space defined in the usual way, downward closed set, right? That gives us possible states. What I would like to note here is that if you think in terms of these modalized state spaces, then there really is no modally indeterminate state under the intended interpretation. Why? Well, if a state is in the set, it's possible. But if it's not in the set, it's impossible. There's no really modally indeterminate state. And yet I still think problem arises, about modal indeterminacy. And the exact and inexact notions of verification and falsification are defined in the usual way. I think in the paper, it's done on an inclusive, with inclusive clauses. But I think what I'm going to do in my own semantics, I use exclusive clauses. Okay. And I shall write this way. Apologies for not following the standard convention. Maybe I should change the notation. But I use plus and minus for verification and falsification. I just don't feel right to just reverse. Anyways, doesn't matter, right? And this triangles to mean inexact notions. Again, with pluses and minuses. All right. And to represent the outcome relation in a very straightforward way, he introduces the transition relation or outcome relation. Okay. So the meaning is this: for any state T and U, so the two relata on the far ends, they can be any states, but in the middle you should have a possible one. And that means intuitively, U is a possible outcome of imposing T as a change on W. So T is an input. You impose T on W, and then the output state is U. So it's straightforward representation, formal representation of the outcome relation. So this is Fine's analysis in the paper. So counterfactual with the antecedent A and C and the consequent C is true at a world W, just in case for any exact verifier for A and for any state U, if U is an outcome of imposing T on the world W, then U, the outcome, should inexactly verify C. Okay? And as you can see, you have two different notions of verification here, but that's reasonable because you don't want to insist that outcome should always exactly verify, right? This inexact verification should be sufficient. So I don't want to take any issue, don't want to make any fuss about that. All right. So, and I would like to, I think that this analysis introduced an ambiguity in the notion of possible outcome, because there are really two notions of possible here. So suppose T is a possible state, and if you impose it on W, you have U as an outcome. But what if U is not a possible state? Okay. Under the intended interpretation of the arrow, it should be a possible outcome, right? But if you want to think about possibility in terms of this modalized, right, possible states, then it should be impossible, right? So there are really two notions of possibility here. And this ambiguity can be resolved. This is not really a serious problem. You can resolve it in many ways, but I think in any ways it amounts to one of these two. And one natural way is to restrict U to possible states this way. So if U is a possible outcome, then U should inexactly verify C. So you consider only possible outcomes. So arrow just stands for outcome relation, and possibility is governed by the state space. So this, if you resolve the ambiguity this way, then any A outcome outside those boundaries will be irrelevant. The truth of counterfactual condition. And that implies that modally indeterminate A outcomes are irrelevant, right? But as I said, they do not really exist, right? In modalized state spaces. So what I should really say, if they existed, they would not be, they would be irrelevant, right? Because, they would not be in this set. Okay. So, if you follow this analysis and acknowledge the possibility of modally indeterminate outcomes, and if you want to incorporate them, right, then you have to say counterfactuals can be affirmed to be true despite the presence of those dangling counter outcomes that are left indeterminate. Okay. All right. There's another way, or the other way, to resolve the ambiguity is just ignore the possible states and just leave the condition as is. Then, it just amounts to saying every outcome should be C verified, right? But then that implies, again, if they existed, modally indeterminate outcomes should be sufficient. Modally indeterminate counter outcomes, right, should be sufficient to prevent this from being true. Okay. Again, what I urged in the first part of the talk was that any truthmaker semantic analysis ought to address the question of how modal indeterminacy bears on their truth. And one might think that this problem just doesn't arise in fine semantics because there are no such modal indeterminate outcomes. However, what I want to say is that's not quite correct. The question arises in a different form, right? It arises as a form of ambiguity in the notion of possible outcome. And if you want to resolve it in one way or another, then you have to commit, right? Make the theoretical commitment as to how to deal with these dangling indeterminate counter outcomes. Okay. So you know this question arises in a different form, and you have to make up your mind, right, as to what to do with them. All right. Okay. In the paper, Fine just offers the truth condition. So, but you want to bilateralize them. Okay. So let's consider how we might do that. Then the natural suggestion would be this, which I call Fine's analysis minus. So counterfactual is false at a world, just in case some outcome is not C verified. Doesn't verify C. Okay. So again, if you take a look, it only requires weak, right? Counter outcome. So use being C indeterminate is just sufficient to make counterfactual false. But again, some might think that this is undesirable. Okay? It's just too easy to make counterfactual false. We want some more positive ground to think that it's false, right? It wasn't that the spirit of false bilateralism, right? All right. So one might try to get around this problem by requiring this constraint on outcome relation, making U possible worlds. So if it's an outcome of any state, it must be a possible world. So there are no small parts. Outcomes are never small parts of the world. They are the world, right? Then every outcome being a possible world should determine the truth and falsity of every statement. Then it amount to requiring counter outcome to be strong, right? Counter outcomes. So that would solve the problem, right? You just by fiat claim that there are no such indeterminate outcomes, right? Consequent indeterminate outcome. But the problem is that the resulting analysis is not entirely without possible worlds. And given that the title of the paper was Counterfactuals Without Possible Worlds, I guess this is not desirable. And I want to do things as much as possible, right, without possible worlds. Okay, that was the part of my motivation. Okay, so just to be sure again, I do not want to say that FA plus and FA minus are untenable, right? For the reasons I just gave you. I think it's reasonable to maintain these two and try to provide an adequate bilateralist analysis. Okay. And I would be very interested to see what logic, right, they give. But that doesn't affect my point so far, right? Because my point is that any bilateralist treatment of counterfactual conditionals ought to address the question of how consequent and modal indeterminacy bears on the truth and falsity of counterfactual conditionals. Right? Well, how am I doing on time? 36 minutes, so I not have enough of time. Okay. But I would like to, as part of motivating, right, my own analysis, I'll just like to say there's a weakness, right, in trying to provide bilateralist or exact analysis of counterfactuals on the basis of these two. And I think it relates to this principle, which I think Professor Fine calls classical weakening. Okay, so when C prime is a classical consequence of C, the counterfactual on the top should imply the counterfactual on the bottom. So you can weaken, right, the consequent. And the failure, so in Fine's analysis, you have to require completeness, namely, all outcomes are possible worlds, right? That was the completeness to get this, to validate this principle. And that was precisely because of the consequent indeterminacy, right? So, if you want to maintain the two, it's not entirely clear how you might get around this problem without requiring completeness, which I think conflicts with the main motivation, right, behind the semantics. Okay. So far, my argument was just that these two questions are important. Okay. Modal indeterminacy and consequent indeterminacy, we can make sense of these two notions, and we have to decide how they bear on the truth and falsity of counterfactuals. And I try to illustrate how these problems arise within a specific system or a semantics. So the question of modal indeterminacy arises when we try to resolve the ambiguity in the notion of possible outcome. So that was one point. And the other question was the question of consequent indeterminacy arises when we try to provide a bilateralist analysis of exact falsification for counterfactuals. And in what follows, I would like to give my own answers to these two questions, which you can already anticipate, right? And develop an exact truthmaker semantic analysis for counterfactuals. So my proposal. So here are three intuitive bases that motivates my own analysis. So an exact verifier for a statement should be by itself sufficient by itself sufficient to verify and falsify the statement, okay, respectively. Okay, and the counterfactual is true only if every counter outcome is impossible. So I'm giving a very strict answer to the first question. And the counterfactual is false only if some strong counter outcome is possible. So again, I'm giving a very strict notion of falsification. So I would like to suggest these two. I repeated this a few times, so you can take a look. Okay. So I use my old framework to formalize this. So let me briefly talk about that. So I introduced two primitive relations between states. T is in alpha S, and that means S exactly thinks that T is possible. So allowing, countenancing, whatever you like. Okay. And B, or beta, T is in beta S, and that means S thinks exactly, right? T is impossible. Exclusion or preclusion, banning, depending on your taste. And I would like to say that these notions are intended to be exact, and we can define their inexact counterparts in the usual way, having in terms of parted relation. And the bar notation is for inexact, right? All right. And I would like to generalize, actually, the transition relation. So the middle relata, right, need not be possible world. You can think of imposing T on S. That should make sense, right? So I'd like to generalize that. That's a minor tweak. And I would like my model to be pointed model. So one world or state will be distinguished as actual state or actual world. Okay. And here's omega T with respect to W, and I define the outcomes of imposing changes, right, in a cumulative way. So whenever U is an outcome of some imposing T on some part of S, it's in this set. Okay. A friend of mine suggested that I should have for all here. That's like eliminative conception, that would be. We can talk about that. But, I think it depends on how you want to model the situation in many cases. So I'm just using this cumulative scheme. And when T is set of states, it's just a union of these sets, for those are in the T. And here's my notation. The A enclosed in bars is the set of exact verifiers for A. And if you put the bar up on it, then it will be the set of inexact verifiers. So if you use these notations, you can express the set of weak counter outcomes this way. It's an outcome of making A true on the world W that doesn't make C true. So this is Z minus, okay, that difference. And these is counter weak, the set of strong counter outcomes. Outcomes of making A true on W that makes C false. So an exact verifier for this should preclude this entire set, right? An exact falsifier for this should countenance exactly, right, something in this set. Okay. And exact falsification is simpler, right? An exact falsifier for the counterfactual is whatever countenances as possible some strong, right, counter outcome. So as exactly falsifies this, just in case, as exactly allows some counter outcome, strong counter outcome. Okay. And to give an analysis of exact verification, we need to first define what it is for a state to exactly preclude an entire set, right? And there's a standard technique for doing that. So suppose you have those outcomes, right? You pick a state for each UI, you pick a state that precludes exactly. And take the union of such precluding states. Right? And that can be called an exact preclusion on the U. So I'd like to suggest that S exactly verifies this formula just in case S is an exact preclusion on this set. So, intuitively it means X thinks everything in this set is impossible. Okay. So we can develop a formal semantics on the basis of this analysis, and it requires 3 assumptions about these relations. So, in my paper for modal logic, I made like a lot of assumptions. Some of them are really hard to, it gives me a lot of trouble. But, here we have much simpler assumptions. There are modally sound states. there are parts of possible worlds, right? Meaning that it doesn't ban and allow at the same time, right? A certain state. And beta, preclusion, is upward closed. If something is precluded, then everything above it is already precluded. And whatever is allowed or countenanced as possible by a modally sound state should itself be modally sound. So if everything that is that part of a possible world thinks possible, right? So S is part. So think of it this way: S is part of a possible world, and T. And S thinks T is possible, right? Then T itself should be a part of possible world. Okay. So that's what it means. Okay. Then I use the definite for the consequence. I use lose consequence. Okay. Okay. Then we can validate these principles. Disjunction on the antecedent position, exact strengthening, triviality, weakening, and conjunction on the consequent position. These are the principles that Fine discusses in his paper. And it is worth noting that these principles can be validated with no constraint whatsoever on the outcome relation, and you can find weakening there. So you don't have to assume completeness to validate weakening. And Fine considers various constraints on the outcome relation. So if U is an outcome of S, then U should include S. The outcome gets larger, right? Actuality, if S is part of a possible world, then, if you impose S on that very possible world, the outcome will be part of that possible world. And incorporation, suppose S has U as its outcome, and U prime is part of the outcome. Then if you fuse S with that part, will give you no larger state. So those are reasonable conditions, I think, you can put on outcome relation. And these conditions respectively validate these principles. So if you have inclusion, you have identity. If you have actuality, you have modus ponens. And if you have incorporation, you have what's called cautious transitivity. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go into proof of that. What I just want to say is that if you impose these conditions, right, in my semantics, inclusion will give you identity. Actuality will give you modus ponens, and incorporation will give you cautious transitivity. So exact same condition gives you exact same principle. And in that regard, I think the present proposal is an exactification of Fine semantics. And I also considered various principles of conditional logic and whether they are valid. These are from standard encyclopedia. If you search like logic of conditionals, these are the usual most axioms or principles you can find there, and they can be all invalidated. And those counter models satisfy all the constraints that Fine put on these three constraints. So I constructed a counterexample where those three constraints were met, but these are invalidated. I think it's a good feature. Substitution of logical equivalences, that fails. And in the paper, Fine discusses one specific instance of substitution of logical equivalence, and that fails, right? We can construct a counter model whether that instance fails in particular. Well, you know, as I said, my original motivation was to try to give an exactification of fine semantics, and that's also so far so good. So I wanted all I wanted to get. All right, so conclusion. So my starting point was this. When we think about counterfactuals in terms of specific making small changes and what they lead to, we can make sense of two notions of indeterminacy: modal indeterminacy and consequent indeterminacy. Okay, and I argued in the first part of the talk that these two notions create a problem for any project that tries to provide a bilateralist analysis for counterfactuals. And this is because any such project should answer how these two indeterminate outcomes, right, bear on the truth and the falsity of counterfactuals. So can this be true when some counter outcomes are modally indeterminate? And can that be false when only weak counter outcomes are possible? And I discussed how these problems arise within the context of fine semantics. So the first question arises as a form of ambiguity in the notion of possible outcome. And the second, when we try to develop fine semantics into a bilateralist analysis. Okay. And I gave my own answer based on this three principle. So I'm giving very strict answer to the questions that I raised. And that's the proposal. And I just reported that my semantics, if you develop it formally, validates the very same principle as fine semantics under precisely the same condition. Well, I should really add, I need one assumption about countenance relation, that every state inexactly countenances itself, right? So, reflexivity in countenancing, right? But I think that's okay, right? In this context, at least. And I think that's only needed for modus ponens. So not too bad. And I also reported that my semantics invalidates that some of the problematic principles like conditional excluded middle and contraposition. So in this regard, I should like to say that my semantics is an exactification of Fine's original semantics, a bilateralist exactification. All right, thanks for your attention.